Hi guys, Rani here. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about me, I guess. I want to talk to you about my novel series. It's called the Druid Novels. If you've been following me online at all, you probably know about the Druid Novels. They are a series of, it's a fantasy series. It's a non-continuous fantasy series, so they haven't been released in order, at least not in chronological order, and they don't need to be read in any specific order, which is why I'm going to read an excerpt for you today, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the thing that I really like with this series is that you can really pick it up from anywhere and read it. The only one that's going to be dependent on you reading the rest of the series will be the last one, and that one will be out later in 2020. But so I wanted to take a little bit of time and just show you the books, show you the covers at least, and then we're going to get into a little excerpt because why not? I like reading. You like reading. Let's read. So the first one that I released was Coitier, People of the Woods. And this is probably one of my favorite covers. This is the one that I get a ton of compliments on this cover. So this was my first release through Rad Writing. I had self-published Telekinetic before that, but that one will soon be off the market, so we don't go there. Don't self-publish. At least not through Ex Libris. But anyway, this was my second release. It came out in 2015, and it's still kind of my baby. This was the first one in the Druid novels to come out. It was the first one that I wrote. Chronologically, it's the second book in the series. The next one that came out was Kedwig, People in the Vines. Again, I love this cover. Look at that. Look at that. Look how cool that is. This one is a little bit scarier, I would say, than Coitier is. Coitier is very light. Coitier's, if you don't read fantasy, I call Coitier my starter fantasy. So it's a good, I don't read fantasy, I don't know if I want to read fantasy. Well, read Coitier and see if you like it. If you like Coitier, then you'll probably like fantasy. Kedwig's a little step up from that. It was, I believe it was the next one that I wrote. I think I started the next one here, but then I didn't finish it, and then I wrote this one. So I didn't know that it was a series. When I wrote Coitier, I had no idea that this was a novel series. I thought it was a standalone novel. I was super excited because I had only ever written series before. But so when I started Coitier, which is this one, I didn't know it was a series. I thought it was a standalone, and it is really beautiful as a standalone. I love it as a standalone. But again, you can read any of the books in this series as a standalone, and it'll read perfectly fine. It'll read beautifully. Like, you wouldn't know it was a series if you weren't looking for a series. But so I fought writing Kedwig. I didn't want to. I didn't want it to be a series. I didn't want to write more in this world. I wanted it to be Coitier and done. Well, the muse wouldn't let me not write it. So I wrote Kedwig, and I actually really like it. It's one of my favorites. They're all my favorites. Who am I kidding? So Kedwig was a really fun write, even if I was fighting it the whole time. And I think it's a really fun read. The next one that came out was really tricky for me, actually. I started it, like I said, this is during the point in time when I'm fighting this being a series. I don't want this to be a series. It's not a series. It's not a series. It was a series. So when I started writing this next one, I started it as a different book entirely. I started it as this little pirate adventure story. And then I got about 100 pages into writing that and wrote Kedwig, came back and wrote Dur, People in the Water. I don't know how to swim. I'm going to start right there. I have no idea how to swim. I live in a desert, and when I was a kid, I figured I live in a desert. There's no water. Why do I need to know how to swim? And I sink like a rock. I just do. One day I would like to learn how to swim. Half of this book takes place underwater. I had to do so much research to figure out how to write this, just because I didn't know how to write anything underwater. How do you write that? How do you write about swimming if you don't know how? I asked all my friends, what does swimming feel like? It was hilarious how much research I had to put into writing this book, but because of that, this is also one of my favorites because it was a challenge for me to write, and it's really a lot of fun. If you like seafaring adventures, this is a really good one. The next one that came out is the one that we're going to be reading from today, and that's Mined, People of the Hills. I again really love the cover on this one. I love the misty mountains. I just think that's gorgeous. This one is completely different from the others in the series. The others in the series tend to focus on a young adult protagonist coming into their own. Doer is also a little different. Doer focuses on the druids, who you'll meet in a minute when we do the excerpt. Kedwig focuses on a set of twins who are both just coming of age. And Koitir focuses on Elia, who is still technically a kid when this comes out. It is set in a world where your idea of what is a kid is probably not everyone else's idea of what is a kid, because a 13-year-old is an adult. But in Mined, my main protagonist is a fully adult woman. She's about 30. And all of the main characters around her are either right around her age or in their mid-20s. So it was a really, really unique and different write for me, because it wasn't in the same vein as the rest of the books at all. It was very different, it was very unique. And it starts out in a completely different way than the rest of the stories. The rest of the stories are kind of a little bit of a slow build. They'll get you in there, they'll ease you in. Mined, I throw you for a loop in the first few pages. If you've read any of the Druid novels, when you read Mined, you'll be surprised. And so that's the one that I really want to start with when we do an excerpt. But there's one more book that's been released, and that is Anjelich, People of Sand. This one came out last year, so 2019. It is the chronological first in the series, and the second to last to be released, because it was the second to last that I wrote. I didn't know how the story started until I wrote Anjelich. I didn't, like I said, I really fought writing the series. I didn't want it to be a series. So I didn't know how it started, and I didn't care how it started. And then it finally got to the point that I needed to write the beginning. And I think it took me 4 or 5 tries to actually figure out how to write this story, because I knew what happened at that point. By the time I sat down to write it, I had written down some notes, I had figured out a few things, but I didn't know how to write this story. So of all of them, I would say Anjelich is the most slow burn. Anjelich kind of starts out slow and is more intrigue and intensity, and it's not in the same vein as the rest of the books, and that's kind of what I love about it. I love that with the Druid novels in general, is that they're all completely different. I can't, when someone walks up and says, oh, what's the series about? I can't answer that question very easily, because each book is so different. Sure, they're all standalones, they're all in the same fantasy series, but because they're standalones, because it's a series of standalones, I could make each book into something completely different. And I think that's a lot of fun, and I think that's a lot of fun for readers, and I hope that you guys enjoy it. If you want to check out any of the books, I will leave links in the description box, so you can go do that. If you want print copies, I highly recommend you get them directly from Rad Writing. Actually, if you want ebooks too, I highly recommend just going straight through the publisher, because you get a copy you can share with your friends and family if you want. And from there, I think we're going to dive right into it. So let's read an excerpt from what I generally call my favorite book in the series. Gregory stood on the steps of Commons, looking out over the village as dusk fell. It hadn't been that long yet. They could have still been out there, still fighting. There was no way to know until either they returned or 3 days passed without news. They still had time. He repeated those words in his mind over and over, fighting against every fear within him that they had not survived, that no one was left alive at all. The feeling nagged away at his waking mind, flashing with fantastical images of what was going on out there. death filling the valley where their armies had gone. And through it all he saw Eronwyn and Sasha, the two among them who meant the most to Grigory, falling beneath the swords of their enemy. He shook his head for the 1000th time, washing the thought from the front of his mind, though still it lingered somewhere in the darkness, waiting for a time to show itself again. That time came more quickly than he'd anticipated, when 2 perimeter guards appeared before him, ushering one of the warriors who'd been sent with Eronwyn. Karin, her name was. She was a good fighter. Grigory and Eronwyn had discussed her in detail, her ability to fight and her minimal life at home. Her family was small. They would have missed her if she were lost, yes, but they would have been all the more honored for it. She shouldn't have been here, least of all alone. Karin, he said, hoarsely, all moisture gone from his mouth as the images flooded back to the forefront. They were gone, weren't they? I'm sorry, she breathed, in a similar state as he. She didn't even look up at him, her hazel eyes instead focusing on the steps rather than anyone who might cause her more pain, anyone who might already know just by looking at her what had happened. Her clothes were spattered with blood, both red and milky white. 2 of her knives and her sword were missing. She wore no covering over her head as she usually did, and her boots were caked with earth from her hard trek back from the war. By the look of her, things had been worse than he'd imagined. There was no end to them, she said, shaking her head as she fell to her knees. It's all right, Grigory told the guards who still stood over her. Return to your posts. I'll see she's taken care of. He stood atop the steps only long enough to ensure they'd gone, leaving him alone with Karin before he squatted down beside her and placed his hand on her shoulder. Are you all right? He whispered, his heart pounding hard in his chest. How could she be, after all she'd been through? They just kept coming. She shook her head, her entire body trembling as she recalled the events of the war. We were no match for them. You're safe now, he reminded, even knowing it wasn't true. No one was safe, especially now. If the Druids knew his people were now willing to take the war to them, to go out there and do battle rather than wait around for the fight to come here, in his heart Grigory knew none of them would ever be safe. The Druids were coming, surely. It was only a matter of time. Nothing had changed. It was as he'd feared, even as he sat with Eronwyn at his own table, planning their attack. Karin finally looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. There was no recognition in her gaze, nothing to tell him she even knew who she was looking at. She only looked up at him in terror. They're gone, she said, lifting a single hand to her mouth as she wept. All of them. There were too many. There was nothing we could do. They killed... She gasped for breath between sobs. They killed everyone. His heart fell and he closed his eyes as he heard those words, but it was not the face of his brother who then appeared behind his eyelids. He chided himself for not thinking of Sasha, for thinking of himself instead of his family, but his heart would not allow it. They'd been dealt a blow today, but more than that, his own family would suffer now. Sasha had been their heart, the one person who always reminded them that there would still be joy in a world so darkened by war. What were they without him? For that matter, what were they without Eronwyn? She'd come to mean more to any of them than Grigory had at first expected. In many ways, she was already a member of their family. They were gone. He'd known it all along, hadn't he? Sir? Grigory hadn't bothered to look up toward the guard who stood on the steps. Summon the council, he ordered, opening his eyes only to look into Karin's. We have news of our people. His fingers gripped tightly to Karin's hand as he helped her to her feet, saying nothing as he led the woman, wailing though she was, up the steps of Commons and into the building. He knew very well that this was not the place she needed to be right now, that she would have been better off anywhere else. But the council needed to hear the words she just told him and understand the gravity of the situation. The entirety of Eronwyn's strike force was gone, if what Karin said was true. He led her into the council chambers and sat her in a chair while they waited, still saying nothing, still in shock over the words he'd heard. It could have been hours before the council arrived, but he didn't notice. Grigory simply sat on the table beside Karin, his hand upon her shoulder as she wept. What is it? Nestor asked as he and a group of the councillors entered the room. Grigory didn't so much as lift his eyes from the ground. He left that to Karin. Dead, she whispered between sobs. They're all dead. Sasha followed the druids all the way to a large body of water, one he was certain none of his people had seen before. If anyone had seen this place, it would have been a prime candidate for the new colony, aside from the mass of druids that now inhabited the area, of course. But back then, as far as anyone knew, there hadn't been any druids here. They'd all kept to hiding, wherever it was that they went, deeper in the hills. Then again, this might have been the place they hid. He crouched in the bushes at the edge of the tree line, keeping quiet. None of them had noticed his presence as far as he could tell, and he needed to keep it that way. It was better for everyone if they didn't know he was here as long as was possible. It surely wouldn't take them long to notice the blood trail he'd left behind. The druids brought all the bodies to the edge of the water, and they chanted over them. The words were in Basic, spoken so quickly and softly that Sasha had trouble understanding them. All he truly understood was something about Vartis, souls, and accepting them into a tree. None of them made any sense, but they seemed very intent on whatever they were doing. Dozens of them there were on the grassy shore that surrounded the lake. They all worked over the humans, wrapping their bodies in large flat leaves he imagined they'd taken from the forest across the lake, where the tangle of vines and greenery grew too dense to see within. They couldn't have come from the evergreens, or from the giant redwoods. Behind him in the hills, the trees were spaced farther apart, and there were no vines to speak of. Most of the trees were pine and aspen, and they kept to their own space. But the other side of the lake, things were much different. There was a section filled mostly of redwood trees, taller than most of those he'd seen before, wide enough that he could have stretched his arms out and not come halfway to the edge, and the forest beyond turned to the chaos of trees and vines. He doubted anyone would be able to move through it at all. There was a place in the plains that bordered a forest like that. If he had to guess, he would say they were one and the same. The two forests must have met here, at this valley lake, this place that transitioned the world from the forests into the hills. It was one of the most beautiful places he'd seen in all his life, and if it hadn't been for the druids that filled the area nearest him, he would have greatly desired to explore it more deeply. Much could be learned from a place like this. Perhaps they could delve deeper into those trees, find a way to set up another village there instead of the one they tried to make in the hills. Maybe that was what they should have looked into from the very beginning. His eyes turned back toward the druids as the chanting lifted in volume, nearly covering the sound of the falls to Sasha's left. That was truly a sight. He'd never really seen falls before at all. They'd hardly come across any rivers that moved down the mountains. All his people had found were rivers that moved through the bases of the valleys. They'd even set up dry run relatively near one of the streams before realizing the water held certain chemicals that caused illness. They'd had to dig wells to make up the difference while the river water was purified. Sasha watched earnestly as the druids took handfuls of water from the lake and poured them over the bodies of his fallen comrades. They took such care in their actions that he wondered whether this war was actually something they'd wanted. Every druid he'd come across in the past was a ruthless warrior. They didn't treat their victims like this. Back in the colony, people told tales of what the druids did with bodies they took. The theories spread far and wide, but the most popular was that the bodies were taken deeper into the forests, cooked and eaten. From what Sasha saw now, these creatures had no intention of eating those they'd slaughtered. They'd taken great care to clean the blood from the bodies, wiping them with leaves that were then torn and thrown into a large basin that looked as though it frequently held flames. They even sewed up the largest of the wounds, making the humans look more like they had when they were alive. But it was what they did next that truly fascinated him. The druids covered the faces of the humans with large leaves, and tied the leaves in place over the bodies. They made sure everything was secure, and they placed each body into its own raft, made of dead wood and vines from the forest across the way. The rafts were pushed out into the open water, and the druids lifted up their hands to the sky as the chanting increased in volume once again. Just as the bodies made it to the center of the lake, the sun dipped to the horizon and lit the sky in orange and yellow. The druids dropped to their knees, their faces planted to the ground, and continued their chant. Sasha rose up a little higher, wincing against the pain in his ankle, trying to get a better view as the bodies made their way farther away from him. When all of them were there, collected in the center of the lake, the sunlight faded and a flash of light burst from the water. The flames in the basin were lit with a green fire that, as far as Sasha knew, shouldn't have been possible at all. Even from where he crouched, he saw that the bodies were gone. Druid magic had taken them away, to where he doubted he would ever know. Since he'd been here watching them, he hadn't seen any place they could have taken Aranwan. If they'd brought her here, it would have only been to send her off in this strange way. They wouldn't have brought her here to go through this ceremony if she was alive. At least, he hoped they wouldn't. His brow furrowed as he watched them, one by one, making their way from the shoreline. He crouched back down, keeping himself as low as possible, and watched, one hand on his ankle and the poor wrapping he tied around it. Someone had to be in charge here, and maybe they would know where Aranwan had been taken. If she was here somewhere, Sasha needed to know, trying to keep as still as possible despite the pain in his leg, and fighting the idea of crossing the boundary and washing his wound in the crystal-clear waters. He scanned over the crowds of druids, looking for one who knew what they were doing. Soon enough, he found their leader. He'd seen the female before, on multiple occasions. She always led the druids into battle, but she was hardly ever seen to fight. In fact, Sasha had never seen her take hold of a blade. Now she was speaking to another druid, a male. Though Sasha scanned the area around her, he knew he couldn't get to her. The woman was probably very well guarded at the very least, and though he'd never seen her with a sword, he had no doubt she knew how to protect herself. He turned away from her and watched as some druids returned to the water's edge and cupped the liquid in their palms, drinking from their hands. Automatically, he grimaced at the thought. They'd just left dead bodies in that water, and now they were drinking it. That couldn't be healthy. He was so focused on them, so curious as to why they would do something like that, so soon after completing what could only be described as a funeral procession, that he didn't notice when the druid male who'd been speaking to their leader walked up to him. He looked down at Sasha, his eyes burning and his black skin shimmering in the light of the green flames. Sasha slowly turned to look up at the man, but before he could run, the druid reached down and took hold of his arm. "We've been expecting you," the man said. Songs whispered through the sky, drowning the sound of the falls from Risiad's ears. The sun was starting to dip beneath the horizon, and it was time for the burials to take place. They'd moved all the human bodies from the valley and brought them here, while some of the others stayed behind to clean the blood and smell of battle from the trees and out of the ground. This was what they were forced to do after every battle, since the humans almost always left bodies behind in the forest. The bodies would decay and spoil the ground for centuries to come if it was not properly cared for and blessed immediately after the death. The bodies were all brought here, to the falls, to be purified and buried in the ways set forth by the Vartus, ways that should have been held among all humans as well as Minid. After all, humans were the beloved of the Creator, made in the very image of the Vartus. They were meant to be the joy of their Creator, and instead, they'd come to this. They couldn't even care for the bodies of the dead when they were left behind. Risiad shook his head as he watched the burials take place. He'd seen this time and again, and it never became any easier to watch. It wasn't something that the Minid should have been forced to do, but there was no other way. This was their commission, set forth by the Vartus. Minid were pure, as were the lands they cared for. The hills could not be spoiled by this war, no matter what. That was the ultimate goal in everything they did. This place could not be changed. Hildor stood beside him, her hands folded in front of her, and her lips moving, though no immediate sound ushered forth. She spoke on the wind, carried the songs of the burials to a higher place, up into the heavens for the ears of the Creator. These humans would be taken up to the Tree of Souls until the time was right for them to be judged and sent to their eternal homes. That would be carried out by the Kedwig. Minid were only for the purification and the burial itself. When the witch finally ceased, Risiad took his moment. He took hold of her arm to prevent her from leaving, and she turned to look him in the eye. She'd been avoiding him since the human woman had been brought to the den, and he knew why. She didn't want to discuss the issue with him. According to the will of the Vartus, Penith and Witch were intended to work together in times such as this. Risiad wasn't about to be left out just because his lord didn't want to speak to him. She shouldn't be in there, he said, keeping to the tongue of the Vartus while the burials were still taking place. To speak the language of Minid now would be dishonorable. "We have no other place to keep her," Hildor replied. "The valley will be prepared soon," he retorted. "She could go there after everyone has moved back to their homes." "I cannot ask our people to live there," she shook her head. "Humans know its location, and they may come for us again. I will not ask that the children be raised in such a place. Then we'll take them above the falls," he pointed to the cliffs high above the lake. "They'll be safe there. No human has ever come this deep into the forest on their own." Hildor's eyes carried up to the cliffs. The mountain plateau would be more than enough space for their people to live. They hadn't considered it before because of its proximity to the den, if the humans were to find them. If something was to go wrong, and the humans were again told of their location, they would know where the main den entrance was as well. But now there may not have been another option. Some of their people were already up there waiting for the time when they would be sent up to another village. They had some of the children with them, those who were old enough to remain outside without getting into mischief. It wouldn't be a feat to move everyone there, to build a more permanent settlement for their people. Risiad had thought it through already. He wanted the people safe just as much as she did. They'd spoken of it before, and she'd always assumed that he thought first of the forest, of the hills, and then of the Minot. But in truth, he cared for them all. He looked out for them all, and he knew the time was right. They could be close to the den now. We would have to be more careful, she whispered, shaking her head. No one else could be captured. We'll double our efforts, Risiad nodded. His eyes shifted to the human man who hid in the bushes a few yards away. As far as the man knew, he had yet to be seen. Risiad smiled to himself. They'd led the human here, if only so he wouldn't have to be carried. They would take him into the den as well, if Hildor had her way. Eronwyn had spoken this human's name, and the Vartus had said that he should be kept alive. For what purpose, they would soon find out. Hildor once again turned to leave, and Risiad tightened his grip around her arm. What will we do with the humans? He questioned. They will be taken to the village once it is prepared for them, she replied. Until then, they remain in the den, under my protection. Once the humans were moved to the village, they would have to keep a better watch over them. They knew far too much already, even if they did not yet understand it. But he did not want them to be kept inside the den. If the humans were there, if they were in the very place their vile spirits wanted to be, close to the home of Esperos and the lair of the Kithrol, they would soon be able to find out the secrets of the Minot, of the Vartus, to seek out the prison of their god. Nywyn will take responsibility for them, she said. The girl has been gifted by the Vartus for this very purpose. I need her, he replied, his eyes widening in anger and flames licking at his heart as he thought of the protector he'd fought alongside so many times. He did not wish this for her, no matter the honor. You will learn to do your duty without her, Hildor replied, dipping her head and looking at the hand that still held tightly to her arm. Risiad sighed and released her, shaking his head as she turned away. She was still witch. She had dominion over these proceedings. The humans were her ward, not his. The duty of the Penith was to care for the land, for the people. The future of humans was no real concern to him, except when it came to the will of the Vartus. Hildor stepped closer to the water's edge as the burials came to an end, and lifted up a prayer to the Vartus. Risiad kept his eyes focused on the human who crouched at the edge of the tree line. The man was fixed on the events near the water, so much so that he didn't even notice when Risiad moved from his place and stepped closer to him. Maxim sat with Isaac in the one place they could both agree to be on a night like this, the tavern. After Karin's return from the valley, Max hadn't wanted to go anywhere. He'd wanted to stay home and wallow, to wonder what had happened to Eronwyn. Already he'd been forbidden from going into the forest and finding out. Grigory had gone through the trouble of having Melor give him a direct order. He couldn't even leave the village with the express intent of finding Eronwyn and the others. But if he did, he would be removed from the militia, once and for all. In a way, it didn't matter anymore. If Eronwyn was gone, then he almost saw no point in fighting. She was gone, and she'd taken Sasha with her. At that point, it almost seemed better that he go into the forest on a suicide mission than stay here and rot in this place. Isaac had been the only one who could convince him to leave, and only because he was in a similar state. But then, Isaac frequently preferred to be on the edge of conscience. Something in him had broken when the war began. Too many times he'd been on suicide runs. Too many times he shouldn't have come back alive. Ignoring orders, going against his superiors, and yet he was one of the best warriors they had. He could have been the start of a full-on army if Jairan ever came to that, if only he learned how to obey. His little brother spent much of his time in the tavern as it was, drinking his weight in ale on the nights when he didn't have guard duty at the perimeter, and flirting with whatever manner of women happened to wander inside, or so the stories said. It wasn't very often that Max came here himself. Maxim couldn't say it was the life he'd always hoped Isaac would have, but he knew better than to try to fight it. Isaac was set in his ways, and he saw no need to change. The man was partly broken from their losses, and he used his brokenness in the only way he could. He channeled it into his fighting, into the war. But now it was almost insane the way he fought. No one expected his luck to last. Maxim had never seen such skill and finesse in one so young. It nearly always took far longer than that to train a young man in the art of war. But Isaac had picked it up like it was the only skill he'd ever wanted to learn, as though he'd been born to fight. And yet he'd never had a mind to use the skill as he should have. Isaac was far too reckless when it came to his own life, and generally didn't care what happened when he was within the village. He did whatever he wanted to do whenever he wanted to do it, and no one had the heart to stop him. Even Grigory allowed him to go about and do whatever he would without so much as a second glance. Isaac was old enough to make his own decisions, and none had the right to change him. But he would never meddle with someone else's life, never risk someone other than himself. Max respected that at the very least. Eronwyn had embraced Isaac from the start. She'd understood him in a way none of his brothers had been able to do. Isaac had taken the deaths of their parents very differently from the other siblings. The sisters had fallen into sadness, but it had lifted when Grigory stepped up. Maxim had burned with a fire he'd never known before, but one he'd been able to keep at bay. Sasha had found his happiness again. Grigory threw himself into his studies and his family. But Isaac channeled their deaths. He used them wherever he went, whatever he did. Max wondered if he would ever really understand his little brother. Looking at Isaac now, he knew at least they had one thing in common. Sasha. They both wanted to go out into the forest, to go to the valley and find the body of their brother. By now it was unlikely that any bodies had even been left behind. It had been long enough that the druids had stolen the bodies. But that didn't stop them from wanting to go and see. Sasha was the best of them, the one to keep them all together. Even when Isaac was at his worst, when Grigory had ignored the rest of the family, and when their sisters had fallen into the deepest of pities, Sasha had been there to restore their family. He'd shown them all how to laugh and smile again, how to find beauty in the little things. And now, as far as they knew, he was dead. The least they could do was go and look for his body. It was better that he be buried here, where their sisters could see his grave, than he be given a pyre. The two brothers sat across from each other at the communal table in the tavern, a pint of ale before each of them. Though the bar was full, crowded with militia and villagers alike, their table was empty aside from the two. It seemed everyone knew better than to sit with the brothers while so much darkness hovered over them. Max had hardly touched his drink, but Isaac's was drained almost completely dry. The younger of the two continually shifted his eyes about the room, pausing only occasionally on whatever had caught his eye. His fingers thrummed on the surface of the table, and he gestured with his other hand to the barkeep. He wanted another drink. Since the war began, the militia had consumed more alcohol than the council had expected. Barkeeps had started brewing their own ales underground, strong enough that the soldiers generally didn't have to drink as much. But Isaac had never embraced that thought. "Don't you think you've had enough?" Max whispered under his breath, imagining that the sound would be drowned out by the noise of the tavern-goers. Isaac's eyes shifted straight into his, and he shook his head. The elder brother knew better than to press the issue. Isaac would stop when he was ready to do so. They both sat in silence a while longer as the sun fell below the horizon and darkness covered the valley. Max finished his ale, and Isaac downed his second pint. As he set down his flagon, he looked his elder brother in the eye, for the first time in a long while. His eyes lit up, and he leaned forward. "When do we leave?" Isaac whispered, just loudly enough for Max to hear. He had a twinkle in his eye, and Max immediately knew what he was thinking. Isaac hadn't been ordered to stay in the village. Even Melor knew it was better to let Isaac make his own decisions than to order him around. He didn't often take well to authority, and he performed much better when he was allowed to make his own decisions. If he hadn't fought the ranks, he probably would have already been promoted to working alongside Eronwyn. That is, before she'd been killed. When left to his own devices, Isaac was one of the best of them, as long as recklessness didn't factor in. Maxim swallowed hard and folded his hands on the table. "It'll have to be dark," he said. "You don't have to come with me," Isaac replied. "Don't I?" he sneered. Isaac knew Max's feelings very well. He couldn't leave Sasha's body behind, true, but more than that, he couldn't go on not knowing if Eronwyn had actually been killed. The younger smiled darkly and pushed his cup to the side of the table. "We'll have to leave tonight, or they'll take the bodies." Max nodded, his eyes unfocused as they slipped down to the surface of the table. In his mind's eye, he saw Eronwyn lying dead on the ground, her eyes wide open and her throat slit. It was the only damage he could imagine on her body. He couldn't believe that any other method would have been able to stop her. She knew better than most how to look out for herself. Maybe even better than Isaac. He didn't know how he would react if he saw her dead body right before his eyes. "How will we get out without being seen?" Max whispered. "I have a way." Isaac nodded, tapping his fingers against the table. His eyes traveled around the room yet again, this time pausing on a young woman who stepped into the tavern on her own, her eyes red with tears. He sighed and lowered his gaze, and Max strained for a better view. Irina stood there, clutching a basket of fruit in her hands. She wore a light blue dress, covered only by her black mantle, the hood slung back on her shoulders. Her soft blonde curls framed her face, falling just below her shoulders, and her brownish-green eyes glanced over the faces that surrounded her. He knew by the look on her face that she was looking for them, that she searched for her two brothers. Grigory had likely been too busy to speak to her, but Max knew by her eyes that she'd heard about the skirmish. She knew Karen was the only one to return. Her eyes scanned over the room, stopping only when they looked into his. She walked briskly toward them, moving one of her hands to hold the edge of her mantle as she did so. Her demeanor was so dark, so broken, as if it had been shortly after their parents had given their lives. "Max," she whispered as she sat beside him, her voice hitching slightly. Instinctively, he reached over and took her hand. No matter what, he didn't want Irina to be in pain. She'd lost much in her life, only to be given away to a man she hardly knew. They all understood that Grigory hadn't truly had a choice in the matter, that he needed to find better homes for the sisters, if only to remove them from the place of their parents' deaths. But Irina's gentility only served her harm in the change. She didn't want to leave her home so soon, especially with a man of whom she knew so little. But it was the life their mother and father chose for the girls, and she knew better than to fight her brother's decision to follow in their footsteps. She did as she was told, quietly fading into the background of her new husband's life. But Max knew, by the look on her face alone, that her husband hadn't understood her pain when she'd found that her twin brother was lost to her. Stiffly, she pulled her hand away. Now that she sat at the table with them, her demeanor changed. When he looked into her eyes, he didn't see a woman in pain. He saw a woman burdened by anger and grief. She set her basket in front of her on the table and slid it toward Isaac. "If you're going, I'm going with you." Her eyes looked straight into Isaac's, as though speaking to him of something only he would understand. "You don't even know how to fight," Maxim whispered, moving his hand to her shoulder. He brushed her hair away from her ear, doing his best to smile when she slid a little closer to him. She trusted her brothers. Of course she did. "Tell him," she said, her eyes focusing back onto Isaac. "Please." Isaac sighed and leaned back in his seat. "She knows how to take care of herself," he replied. "She won't be a burden." Max's hand tensed over his sister's shoulder as Isaac's words sunk in. The only way Irina would have known how to fight was if Isaac taught her. Grigory had forbidden it while the sisters were still at the house, believing it would be better for them to forget the events of that night. Isaac had never been one for listening to his eldest brother, or anyone else for that matter. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "Your husband doesn't need to know how I spend my time," she snapped. "I know what you're planning, and I'm going with you." She turned to look Max in the eye, her gaze narrowing until he moved his hand away from her and slowly nodded. If this was what she wanted, then he didn't have the right to stop her. Nywin stood in the doorway to one of the smaller rooms in the den, green flames lighting the whole space. She faced inward, watching over the human who slept inside, just as she'd been asked to do. After the woman met Hithor, the witch had prayed to the Vartis so she would be allowed to sleep. It was a sleep that the Vartis gave to many whose minds were in shock after meeting the Duin. The Creator sent them into unconsciousness, not to wake until they were fully prepared to do so. When Aranwen's mind was ready to accept where she was and what had happened, she would awaken. Only then would Nywin's task truly begin. She'd spoken to the High Witch several times already since Aranwen had been left here, and still she didn't know exactly what she had been called to do, or why she had been chosen above all others. She was a protector, not a witch or wanderer. Her life was devoted to war, not this. Hithor had said that the Vartis would make everything known to her in time, and that she would not be alone. But the only thing she'd gathered was that she was to work alongside the Penith, which was something she'd already done for the better part of her life. Of all Duin, the protectors were the most closely knit. They had to work together more than most other factions of any given Duin, especially when it came to harnessing their emotions and using the great power given them by the Vartis. Their duty was not easy, nor was it enjoyable, but it was what they were called to do. The minds of the protectors were focused first upon the land they were sworn to protect, and then upon the Duin within it. Nywin and her kind instinctively cared more about the forests, the mountains, than they did the minded themselves. It was something many others had difficulty understanding, but it also meant she was not designed for this task, for the duty of watching over a human woman who would wake at an unknown time in the future. For that matter, she didn't understand why Hithor herself wasn't as involved in this process. Peace was something they'd wanted to achieve from the beginning, but something that had been unattainable. They'd worked hard to find common ground between their peoples before the battle began, and they'd found nothing of use. The Vartis had only now opened the door for them to begin again, for peace to be a viable option, and Hithor seemed ready to give up, prepared to sit down and allow everything to go on without her. At some point, the witch had to speak with Aranwen. It couldn't all be left up to Nywin. She closed her eyes and sighed. It had been many hours since the human had fallen asleep, and Nywyn had stood here through the majority of it. Her duties with the Protectors were the only things that called her away, that prevented her from fully carrying out the wishes of the High Witch. There was another human here, one the Vartus did not wish to be slain, and Rhesiad believed her duties extended to that human as well. She could not deny the Penithe, nor the will of the High Witch. She glanced out into the empty hall, then back to where Aronwen lay. She was in Hithdor's domain, and would remain here until such time that they found a new place for her. Nywyn had spent much of her time here considering the future. There was no way to know how things would play out now that they had humans within their midst. It was very possible that this woman would employ the same tactic as they, and try to kill herself before they could even speak with her. If that happened, Nywyn had no idea what would become of this war, of the hills themselves. Aronwen was the name Hithdor had heard, spoken by the Vartus. If they no longer had her, would it mean they could no longer achieve peace? Her eyes narrowed as she stared down at the woman. She was at peace for the moment, in a way that made it difficult to imagine how fierce she would be when she finally woke. She looked frail now, helpless, light and powerless, lost to sleep. But it was not beyond Nywyn's imagination to see this woman fighting and killing so many Myned. Nywyn had faced Aronwen in battle herself. She knew what power lay within those bones. Surprisingly, Aronwen had been complacent when she was brought here. She'd been stripped of her weapons while she was in rest to avoid any bloodshed within the den. For the most part, however, she had seemed utterly consumed by fear. She'd done nothing but stare or scowl at Nywyn as long as she was awake, though Nywyn had done nothing to harm the woman since she'd arrived. If Aronwen was the person they needed in order to bring this war to an end, then Nywyn intended to find every ounce of patience within her body and wait until Aronwen was ready. But human minds were frail, susceptible to fault, and they did not follow the will of the Vartus, for they did not know it. And Nywyn had no idea where to start in bringing this woman to see the light. This was not a duty meant for Protectors. Grigory tapped his foot lightly on the ground, slowly shaking his head. He couldn't believe it. He'd been standing guard outside the tavern waiting for Isaac and Maxim to come out and start planning their escape into the forest. He knew his brothers well enough to know they wouldn't be talked out of looking for Sasha and Aronwen. After all, she'd promised she would keep their little brother safe. If anyone was going to make it out alive, it would be the two of them. Aronwen was always true to her word. But what Greg saw before him now was the last thing he'd expected. Their youngest sister, Irina, Sasha's twin, had joined the two brothers. The three walked outside together as curfew fell, the time when they would all be forced to return to their homes. When they locked eyes on him, they all stopped in their tracks, standing only a few feet away from him in the emptying street. Most of the other people from the tavern were already well on their way home, but these three had no such plans. Grigory had known for some time that Isaac had ignored his requests. Greg hadn't wanted either of their sisters to be trained in the art of war. They would be safe in their homes with their husbands, and they didn't need to have swords to protect themselves. The Druids had no reason to go into either of their homes. No harm could come to them there. Grigory had thought it all through before he'd given his sisters into their matches, but Isaac hadn't ignored Irina's requests. She wanted to know how to fight more than anything in the world, and in Jairan she was allowed to do whatever she chose. As long as her husband did not object, she could spend as much time with her brother as she wanted. In her eyes now, he saw a fire he'd never seen before. She knew well how to fight, yes, but he'd never imagined she would embrace it so much as Isaac. Irina had always been much like her twin. The two had been inseparable in their younger years, and Grigory had hoped it would never change. They were a good influence for each other, Sasha always reminding Irina that it was okay to smile at the cruelty of the world, and Irina always showing Sasha how to hold his own against everything before him. Greg had always loved to watch them, even while he was a growing lad. Seeing Irina now, it was like Sasha had never existed in her life. There was no light in her eyes, only a fire that he doubted would be so easily put out. She wanted a fight, and her brothers were going to give her one. If Grigory knew Isaac at all, the man had already agreed to bring Irina along with them when they planned to leave. After all, Max was the only one who'd been ordered to stay in the village. Irina opened her mouth to speak when a shout echoed through the valley. Automatically, the four siblings ran toward the sound, while everyone else in the streets literally sprinted back to their homes, away from any place that could hold a fight should the Druids once again strike the village. The four ran straight to the source of the shout. Soon Grigory found himself standing in front of his 3 siblings at the edge of the village, holding out his hand toward them in an effort to stop them. Thankfully, they obeyed. They stopped less than a foot behind him, watching while 5 people stumbled beyond the tree line into the place they called their home. Karen had been wrong. Grig let out a sigh of relief as his eyes scanned over them, looking for the 2 faces he knew would end the struggles in his family. But Aronwen and Sasha were not among those who returned. How many, he asked the first man to approach him. How many survived? The man shook his head. I don't know, he breathed. He was wounded, but no worse for wear. As a member of the militia, he'd been trained to fight his pain. He knew his duty in times like this. It was better that he tell someone everything than that he go to a doctor and die before his words could be said. Aronwen? Max asked as he stepped up beside Grigory. Did she make it? He shook his head. They were waiting for us, he said, holding a hand against his bleeding abdomen. They took her. And my brother, Irina asked, holding up a hand to her mouth. She may have been trained in the art of war, but she was not yet accustomed to things like this. She'd never seen a man so brutalized, and yet fully able to tell all before he sought out a physician. The man's eyes shifted to her, and he dipped his head. He lay on the field, lady, he breathed. Irina stepped backward, and Isaac wrapped his arms around her. That was it, then. Aronwen had been taken captive, and Sasha was gone. There would be no point in going after them after this. The bodies, Max said, placing his hand on the man's shoulder. No, sir, he shook his head. The battle was just past dawn. They'll be gone by now. Grigory reached out and placed his hand on Maxim's shoulder as his brother staggered slightly. He didn't want to imagine that it had all been in vain, that even their planning had been futile. There would be no body to retrieve. Thank you, Grig said. See to yourself and your men. Nothing.